Scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Helaman, chapter 2, verses 74 and 75. And now, my sons, remember that it is upon the rock of our Redeemer, who is Christ, the Son of God, that ye must build your foundation, that when the devil shall send forth his mighty winds, yea, his shouts in the whirlwind, yea, when all his hail and his mighty storm shall beat upon you, he shall have no power over you, to drag you down to the gulf of misery and endless woe, because of the rock upon which ye are built, which is a sure foundation, a foundation whereon if men build, it cannot fall. Good morning. I'm excited to be here with you today. I'm grateful for the ministry that we've already received this morning, the beautiful music and the presence of God that's been here with us. I'd like to start off by apologizing for my absence the last few weeks. I know I've been on the schedule to be up here more than once, and due to my poor planning, I've been out of town for one reason or another, and so I haven't been able to be here. But the remark was made by Eldon during Sunday school this morning that because of the extra preparation time out, I have at least 2 hours worth of material to preach from today, so we'll see what we can do. I'd like to speak this morning about trusting God when it's difficult, having an unshakable faith through the storms of life. We each have trials that we go through from time to time. We have difficult things that it's sometimes difficult to see what God is doing in our lives. And I'd like to talk about how we maintain our walk with Him through those times. Not only that, but grow closer to Him through those times. And to do that, we'll be talking about a story that's probably familiar to all of us. It's one that we've heard probably many times in the past. But I think it does a good job of explaining the points I'd like to focus on today. So if you'd like to follow along, we'll start off in Genesis chapter 37. We're talking about the life of Joseph today. So Genesis 37, starting in verse 2. And this is the history of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. So we see Joseph here at the tender young age of 17, and at this point in the story, Joseph's life is going very well for him. He was favored by his father above all of his brothers. His family was doing pretty well. His father had built up a decent amount of wealth for that day. Joseph probably had just about everything that he could have asked for at that time. Verse 4, when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said to him, shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. So we see that not only is Joseph favored by his father, he's also favored by God. The Lord blesses him with these dreams that, according to the interpretation from his brothers and from the rest of his family, lead to, at some point, Joseph being lifted up and given honor and prestige. And so that jealousy starts to develop in his brothers. There's that friction that begins to form there. But at this point in the story, I'd like to point out that it doesn't look like Joseph has done anything wrong to deserve the struggles that are coming for him. He was obedient to his father. He was evidently close enough with God that he was able to give him these dreams, to give these promises to Joseph. It doesn't appear as if he's done anything to deserve what's coming for him. And that's the first thing that I'd like us to take away from the story of Joseph's life, is that not every trial that we go through is due to something that we have done wrong. It's not always that God is punishing us somehow for for something that we have done when we come across struggles in our lives. Even though we know that lesson, it can be easy to forget it in the moment. When we go through difficult times, it can be an easy, quick response to just think, God, why is this happening to me? What did I do to allow this to happen in my life? Something's wrong. What did I do that caused this? What we'll see in Joseph's life is that that isn't always the case, and that often it's through those difficult times that the Lord is seeking to bless us and to provide more for us than we understood previously. So we know the story. Joseph's brothers, when he's coming out to them in the field, they conspire against him. Because of this jealousy of Joseph being favored by his father, they betray him and they sell him into slavery. I don't think many of us can understand fully the pain that Joseph must have been feeling at that moment in time, to be betrayed by the people closest to him, to be torn from the only life that he knew, separated from his family and from everyone that he had been close with, completely cut off from the life that he knew. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know that we can imagine that pain that Joseph must have been feeling. And even though we don't, none of us probably experience something that extreme. Some of us in this life are still hurt by those closest to us. And similar to Joseph, we feel betrayed, wounded. We have that pain that we deal with and that sorrow. And the Lord is never absent as we endure those things. Just as we will see in Joseph's life, he's always able to work through those things. Even the worst that life throws at us, he is able to use it for his purposes. And it doesn't matter the intentions of the people that hurt us. God is never limited by what happens in our lives. And if we follow him and if we submit to him, his perfect plan will always shine through. And so, Joseph is brought down into Egypt, into the house of a man named Potiphar. And again, it can sometimes be difficult to see how the Lord is working when we go through difficult situations like this. I know if I were in Joseph's shoes, I would definitely struggle with that. Right? If you were separated from the entire life that you knew, nothing but a servant in this Egyptian's house, apart from anyone that you know, it would be easy to think, what can I accomplish here, God? What good could possibly come from this situation? Seems to be nothing but a negative here. And it's often not until we go through those situations and look back that we see how the hand of the Lord was working in our lives. It's very difficult as we're going through these trials to see and understand what the Lord is doing. And sometimes all we can do is trust him as we're going through it, know that he has it under control. A few years back, I was going to a service project with a youth group here in town. I was actually across the border in Kansas, and I was the one who was driving for this particular service project. This was back when my family had that big Suburban, and I was borrowing that to transport this group of young adults out there. So we made the drive out there. It was about an hour to get there, and right when we were arriving at our location, getting ready for the project, I was coming in a park, and I felt the steering wheel just completely lock up. It was obvious pretty quickly that the power steering had gone out, and it was all I could do to yank the steering wheel and get it parked on the side of the street. And normally I'm not very patient when it comes to difficulties with my car. I'm not a particularly knowledgeable person when it comes to fixing those types of things, and so sometimes I get more frustrated than I should. But throughout this process, I kept, being reminded by the Spirit, I think, to just trust him, to not be stressed out about it, to not worry about it, but to just trust. And like Joseph, I didn't really understand what good could come out of that at the time, but I just trusted. It was one of the few times that I actually listened when I heard that voice. I just took a step back and said, all right, God, I'm going to trust you. So we did our service project, and we went about the day. We continued on. And after we finished up, I started thinking back and realizing some of the blessings that had come through that situation. For one thing, the timing of when that happened. We weren't on the highway where something dangerous could have happened, and we could have really been hurt. It happened just as we were arriving at our location. We had made it safely there. We didn't have to call the people that we were volunteering with and tell them that we weren't going to be able to help out. So that was a blessing. we were able to see the kindness of some of the people that we were volunteering with. A few of them took me up to the gas station and helped me to get some power steering fluid and try out some things to see if we could take care of it on our own. Just all through this process, I kept seeing more and more ways that God had been working in that situation and how he'd been blessing us through that. Again, it's often not until we look back at a situation and see what God was doing that we recognize those things. But from the first moment that Joseph arrives in Egypt, we see that God is working in his life and working through this situation. Picking up our story in chapter 39 and verse 2. It says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. He was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field." And so from the very first moment that Joseph is in the situation, he provides this really powerful witness to the people around him by how he reacts to this adversity that he's facing. It would have been easy for Joseph to respond with just this sorrow and this pity for himself that, I've been betrayed by my family. I'm here a servant in this foreign land. It could have been easy for him to be overcome and to be feeling that sorrow. But instead he chose to be positive. He chose to serve the Lord and to serve the people around him in the best way that he could. He chose to trust God and be faithful to him no matter what happened to him. And because of that, I think it was really powerful witness to those in that house. They're able to see the peace and the joy that the Lord can bring someone as they go through those difficult times. This is something that people around us and people outside the church really recognize. When we go through situations that are not ideal, and we choose to have peace and joy in those circumstances, people recognize that there's something different about us, and they want to know what we have that's different. They want to know what's made that change in our lives and how we're able to have that peace in the midst of difficult circumstances. Joseph gave his best in his work and in the relationships that he was able to build with Potiphar and with his other servants in the house. He didn't grow selfish or focused on himself. He continued to serve and to give God his best, no matter what happened to him. And finally, it says that he brought the presence of God wherever he found himself. Is that something that we do in our work, in our relationships, in our school? When people interact with us, do they recognize that the presence of God was there? Do they recognize that God is working in our lives? When people interact with us, do they feel closer to God just by being around us? And obviously that was the case with Joseph, that the blessing of the Lord was there with him and that the Spirit of God followed him where he went. And it lifted the spirits of those around him. Unfortunately, though, this was not the end of Joseph's struggles. We see before too long that he's once again betrayed, this time by Potiphar's wife. She tells this lie about Joseph that ruins his reputation, loses him his position in Potiphar's house and whatever comfort that he had built up for himself there that he'd earned in Potiphar's house. Because of this, Potiphar throws Joseph into prison. So this was the second time that Joseph was betrayed to the point where he lost everything. God will sometimes give us more than we think we can handle. If I were in Joseph's shoes, I definitely would not be handling this very well. Sometimes it seems like you just can't catch a break and like everything's going wrong around you. And that definitely seems to be the case here for Joseph. Every time it looks like things are kind of coming up, he finds this new obstacle, this new difficulty in his life. And sometimes we go through similar situations where it looks like we just can't catch a break and it looks like everything seems to be going wrong in our lives. But when we experience things like that, we have the same consolation that was extended to Joseph. In verse 21 of chapter 39, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph." Back up to verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Again, God is always present with us as we go through suffering. Sometimes it feels like he gives us more than we can handle, but he never allows us to go through something that is more than we can handle with his help. He will always be there with us. He will always send his Spirit to help us, even if we feel distant from him. When we meet that suffering in our lives with trust in God, his perfect plan is always able to shine through. And so Joseph didn't grow bitter or doubtful through this experience, in spite of the years that he was about to spend in prison. He continued responding in that same way with a trust in God, a faithfulness, a positive attitude, no matter what circumstances were around him. And it was because the source of that attitude, the source of that peace and that faithfulness was the God that he served. It wasn't dependent on his outward circumstances. He had his focus on the Lord, his focus on God's faithfulness, on God's wisdom, on God's love for him. And he recognized that God was still in control in the situation. And truly, throughout that time, Joseph must have been praying. I think it's very likely that he was probably praying for his deliverance, for his freedom. But for most of Joseph's time, for years that he spent in prison, it must have seemed like that was an unanswered prayer. It must have seemed like that answer was never going to come. And that's a difficult thing when we go through these struggles and these trials, and we ask the Lord for deliverance. We ask him to take these things away from us, and we feel like we're not hearing any answers. We feel like our prayers are just hitting the ceiling and going nowhere, and like we're not hearing anything. That can be a difficult thing to go through. But how do we respond when we come to those experiences? What do we think when we go through those times? A few years back, in my sophomore year of college, I think it was, I was trying to decide what I was going to do my next summer. It's always a big thing on college campuses to go to career fairs and get internships lined up for the next summer. And I thought some about that, but what I really wanted to do was be a part of the Book of Mormon internship again. I'd been an intern the previous summer. I had a really good experience there. I thought it would be a cool opportunity to come back and be on staff the next year. This was, I think, late in the fall, and I thought they'd already made their decision for who would be on staff. You have to be asked to come and be on staff, and so I thought I'd missed my opportunity there, and I thought, well, I guess it didn't work out for that. I'll look for something else. And so I decided I would start applying for different internships for my major. Hopefully get some good experience to put on a resume. I started putting out applications. I went to the career fairs, started calling companies, doing everything that I could to get something lined up for the next summer. And it just felt like I kept hitting these dead ends. I was praying about this a lot, really asking God to open the doors and to bring me to the right place. But I just wasn't hearing anything back from anyone. I feel like I didn't even get any phone calls back from these companies. I couldn't understand what was going wrong. I was praying to the Lord one day about this and really getting frustrated, just not knowing why I couldn't get this to work out, why I didn't feel like I was getting any answers. And again, I was just getting very frustrated and wondering, why am I not hearing the answers, Lord? Why am I not feeling like you're directing me at all? I don't understand what you want me to do or what you have for me next summer. And again, I just felt like there was no answer there. About a week after that prayer, I was back here in town for the weekend. Got a call from Lynn and Sugar Baumgart. They typically keep in touch with their former interns. So I thought I'm just going over there to kind of catch up with them. And as soon as I went over there, they asked me if I wanted to be on staff for the internship next year. And that was a surprise to me. Like I said, I thought they'd already made that decision. I thought I had missed my opportunity for that. So I didn't have to think about it very long. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I was grateful for that opportunity. But if God had answered my prayer and putting out those applications to different companies, if he had answered my prayer and opened the door with one of those places, I wouldn't have been able to receive this greater blessing that he wanted to give to me, the blessing that I had asked for originally. And sometimes it's like that when we feel like we're not hearing any answers to our prayers. The Lord withholds those answers because he desires to give us a greater blessing. He sees the bigger picture and he understands what will be best for us in life. He desires to bring us nearer to himself. He desires to provide what's truly going to be best for us. So we must learn to focus on the Lord and trust him, even if we don't understand why we're going through something. And to trust him when it feels like we're not getting any answers to our prayers. Because we can be sure that he always has our best interest in mind. He always has his love extended toward us. That he will do what's best for us. I'm reminded of the experience that Peter had when he walked on the water to go to Jesus. If you remember, he got down out of the boat after Jesus called him to come. And he started walking towards Christ. And at first he was walking on the water and he was doing fine. His faith was strong and he was on the way there. But we're told that the storm started to swell around him and the wind got stronger. The waves were getting bigger. He took his eyes off of Christ and he looked at the waves. He focused on the wind. He looked at the storm around him. And it was only when he did that he started to sink. He started to be overcome by that fear. And I think it's often the same with us, that when we go through difficult times in life, when we find adversity, if we focus on God and on his love, on his grace, if we remember that he is in control and that he loves us, we'll be able to endure those circumstances. But when we focus on the negative in our lives, when we focus on what's wrong, that's when we begin to be overcome. That's when we're stressed out and worried. That's when we're overcome by those negative emotions. So we must learn to focus on the Lord through these times. And it's often through those difficult times and those times when we feel like we're not hearing any answers that God refines our character. He builds up that patience and that hope in us to recognize that even when we can't feel him there, he is always at work and he's always blessing us. He builds up an ability to comfort and encourage the people around us who go through similar situations. And we see that in Joseph's life as well. When he's brought into prison, he again responds with that same outlook. He's faithful to the Lord and he continues to serve him. He doesn't grow focused on himself. He doesn't grow sorrowful. He continues serving the Lord in this positive attitude. He continues loving the people around him. Back in verse 21 again, it says, "The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the overseer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper." So just like Potiphar, the keeper of the prison recognized that integrity in Joseph. He recognized that there was something different about him, and that he could trust him in that situation. Joseph continued to serve him, to serve God and to serve the people around him. He brought ministry to his fellow prisoners. If you remember the story with the butler and the baker, how he interpreted their dreams and helped them and encouraged them. Joseph was always available to be used by the Lord, even though he was enduring difficult things himself. And so after, like I said, years that Joseph spent in this prison, he finally has the opportunity to be delivered. And I think often we forget the time span that we're dealing with when we look at Joseph's life. We usually go through it in a short amount of time, like we are this morning. We talk about it in one sermon or one class. We forget that from the time that Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers to the time that he was delivered from prison was 13 years. Joseph was in captivity for 13 years, and he was 30 years old by the time that he was brought before Pharaoh. He had to be patient this whole time, and he was faithful throughout all of that time. But it wasn't until now that he had the opportunity to be delivered from these struggles. God's timing is not our own, and he knows what is best for us, and he will deliver us in his timing and according to his plan if we continue to trust him. And so if you remember the story, the Pharaoh has this dream that can't be interpreted by anyone in his court. I think it's the butler who's with Pharaoh at the time remembers that when he was in prison, his dream was interpreted by Joseph. And the Pharaoh calls for Joseph and brings him out of the prison. Because of the relationship that Joseph had with God, that he had maintained that relationship and continued to be faithful to him, God was able to work through Joseph and bring the interpretation of that dream. And the Pharaoh then recognizes that same quality of character that's in Joseph. In chapter 41 and in verse 38, we see the Pharaoh's response after Joseph brings this interpretation. Pharaoh said unto his servants, "Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is?" And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." So after all these years, the Lord finally moves in Joseph's life to bring him out of that captivity, out of that pain and that suffering, to give him honor and glory. He brings him out of that and provides the fulfillment of that promise that he gave him so many years ago. Joseph is also reunited with his family. If you remember, the famine that was in the land of Egypt extended also to the land of Canaan, where Joseph's family was at the time. His brothers come to Egypt looking for food. They bow down before this, what they think is an Egyptian, but it's really Joseph, and they ask him for food. They bow down before him, literally fulfilling the dream that he had in his youth so many years ago. It was through the most difficult experience in Joseph's life that God provided the answer, the fulfillment of his greatest promise to him. I think that's often the case with us, that the most difficult things that the Lord allows in our lives, the most painful things that we go through, are there for a reason. The Lord is using those things to provide greater blessings for us. He always has a plan with the things that he allows. I think it's worth noting as well that it was the trust that Joseph had throughout those years in prison and in the house of Potiphar that allowed him to forgive his brothers when they came to him. Jumping over to chapter 45, after Joseph had revealed who he was to his brothers, and they were obviously a bit shocked at first. This is Joseph speaking to them. In chapter 45, verse 5, it says, "Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall be neither earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." So again, it was that same faithfulness and trust that Joseph had that allowed him to forgive his brothers, to find reconciliation with his family. These people that had betrayed him so many years ago and really been the cause of all this pain for Joseph, he's able to forgive them and to find joy and peace once again because of the Spirit of God that he allowed to be in his life. He recognized that the Lord was truly the one behind this. And so Joseph's patience and trust in God is rewarded. He receives the fulfillment of this promise, and the Lord works in his life to bless him, but also to bless his family, the people that would come after him that were delivered because of the wisdom that God gave to him. There's no way that he could have seen what God was doing as he was going through those years in captivity. All he could do through that time was trust the Lord and serve him as well as he knew how at that time. There's no way that he could have seen what was coming or how God would work through that situation. That's the same with us very often when we go through difficulties. All we can do is trust the Lord and continue to serve him as well as we know how. It may have seemed needless at times for him, but he just continued to trust, continued to serve the Lord. And so if we trust the Lord, he can do amazing things in our lives, even through the worst that life throws at us. The last thought that I'd like to leave you with involves how these things apply to us as a church. And it can be easy when we kind of look at the condition of the church around us. It can be easy to be discouraged and to be somewhat doubtful. We look at the division in the church. We look at our own brokenness. We wonder how we will ever become the church that God calls us to be and how we'll accomplish the work that he set out for us to do. I fall into that same trap sometimes of focusing on those things and getting discouraged. What brings me hope that won't be shaken is when I focus on the Lord, the amazing God that we serve, the same God that delivered Joseph from this lowly prison cell to Pharaoh's right hand, this God that is not limited by struggles that we go through in life, this God that is not surprised by anything that has happened to his church. I look at a God that is able to deliver us and to work in our lives and to come through for us. And so we have a choice when we look at these things, when we look at the condition of the church, we look at the things that God has called us to do. We can be discouraged and look at the world around us and look at the storms of life. We can give up hope, or we can trust in the Lord and we respond like Joseph. We can do our best, the best that we know how right now. We continue to trust in the Lord that he knows what he is doing, that he does not call us to understand everything or to know how he will do his work. We can trust him and serve him as best we know how. We can obey him and bring ministry where we are. So I hope that we will continue to trust in the Lord and grow closer to him, putting our trust in a God who is perfectly faithful through every trial that this world can throw at us. I'd like to finish with a scripture from section 77 of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 4. Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye are little children, and ye have not as yet understood how great blessings the Father has in his own hands, and prepared for you, and ye cannot bear all things now. Nevertheless, be of good cheer, for I will lead you along. The kingdom is yours, and the blessings thereof are yours, and the riches of eternity are yours.